Hello, Brubs. We're back with the Boundary Waters Herd of Reindeer as we fire up the little DVD player and play some history of what we got going today, Homer. The Iliad. The Iliad, Brubs. Try to get some of this puzzle done today. Some more of this puzzle done, that is. Got some leg action going there. Much easier to see it in natural light. Great
These
author.
lectures are titled Great Authors of the Western Literary Tradition. Part 1. Near Eastern and Mediterranean Foundations.
Homer. Let's play Homer. Or did I just mess it up and start it over again? Whatever. It'll eventually play. Number 6. General Assembly. I guess it's edge work, too. It's edge work, bruv. It's a continuous motion. I think I paused it. This bullshit. Gotta play it out. Play it out. All right, we got some green.
These lectures are titled Great Authors of the Western Literary Tradition.
We know.
Part 1. Near Eastern and Mediterranean Foundations.
This time, don't touch it, Bob. Let it play out. Let it play out. Play it out. There's more legs. Legs, bruv. I tell you, legs. We got more legs. And we want to admit we got legs. Where's those legs? Get your legs into the skin of the game, bruv. Legs, legs, legs. You gonna play this time, or are you just gonna sit there? Or do I push OK? OK. Okay. There we go. It's okay. It's okay, buddy. Is it okay?
Hello, and welcome back to Lecture
Hello,
11.
Elizabeth.
In this lecture, we're going to begin our survey of ancient Greek literature by talking about the nature of Homeric epic and then turning to look in some detail at the first of the two great Homeric epics, the Iliad. Now, the two Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are the first fully developed epics in Western culture. They are much longer than the Epic of Gilgamesh that we talked about in Lecture 2. They're also much more complex. The characterization is much deeper and richer, and they're much more intricate than the Epic of Gilgamesh, both in their structure and in their narrative style. Because of Greece's influence on later Western culture and literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey served really as the models for all later epic in Western culture. Now, by epic, the Greeks themselves simply meant any long narrative poem in one particular meter. The meter is called dactylic hexameter. That was all they meant by the term. Epic in ancient Greek did not have any reference to subject matter or to content. It simply meant a poem written
Those
in
eyes are
dactylic
dead, aren't they?
hexameter.
Look at those.
However, as it happened,
Can't be those
the two
eyes. That's got to be
Homeric
these
poems,
eyes.
the Iliad and the Odyssey, focused
Can't
on
be, though.
warfare and on the
Too much black in that one.
of a hero. In the case of the
It's
Odyssey,
gotta
his
be this
adventures
one.
on the way back from the Trojan War, and therefore Greece's influence on later European culture meant that the Homeric epics were taken as models for what epic should be, not just in form, a long narrative poem, but also in content. And so the term epic came to mean narrative poem dealing with gods and heroes, very often with war and adventure. And then, of course, we've expanded the term to mean, in effect, any long narrative of whatever form. We can refer to an epic novel, an epic movie, so forth. In fact, interestingly enough, it's because of the association of the term epic with the content of the Iliad and the Odyssey that scholars call the Gilgamesh story the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's no such word in the Akkadian language, and there's no title for the poem that was found on those tablets in the ruins of the library.
Hell yeah, I just got that piece.
In lecture number 2. But when scholars translated this narrative poem about Gilgamesh, they looked at it and they said, what we've got here is clearly an epic, comparing it to the Homeric form, and therefore we call it the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Iliad and the Odyssey were primary cultural texts for classical Greek civilization.
All right, well, that one's done.
By that, I mean that they served as educational tools. They were the works that boys would study first and foremost in school. They also served as paradigms for exempla of how one should and should not behave, as sources for quotation. If you're trying to make a rhetorical point in a Greek law court and you can quote a line of Homer, that clinches the point you're trying to make. And so they were absolutely foundational and primary texts in Greek culture. They also provide, from the later viewpoint, they're also important because they provide the fullest accounts that we have of several episodes from the Trojan War, one of the primary and most important myths of Greco-Roman civilization. Now, neither the Iliad nor the Odyssey tells the full story of the war, but they do give us our fullest accounts of some very important episodes from that war. But as I touched upon in the introductory lecture to this part of the course, despite their status as foundational works of Greek literature, the Homeric epics reflect several centuries of orally transmitted poetry. I already spoke about some of the implications of that in the first lecture, the introductory lecture. Here I just want very briefly to tell you a little bit about how it is that we know that the Iliad and the Odyssey were originally composed orally, rather than being composed by one poetic genius writing in the 8th or 7th century BC. First of all, the events described in the Iliad and the Odyssey took place in the 12th century BC. The traditional date that the Greeks themselves gave for the fall of Troy in the Trojan War was 1184 BC. So that's about the time frame, the
last yellow piece go,
for when the Trojan War took place. However, we know that the alphabet was not introduced into Greece until many centuries later. Most scholars would place the advent of the alphabet in Greece.
There's no way that goes there.
Phoenician alphabet.
Fuck no, it doesn't go there.
Some scholars put it a little earlier, some put it a little later, but most think that the alphabet came into Greece in the 8th century BC. So if the events described by the Iliad and the Odyssey took place in the 12th century, but there's no writing till the 8th century, there's a 400
What's up, Yogurt?
When those stories had to have been carried on.
What a fucking name, Yogurt.
Now, of course, that tells us nothing about the form in which they were carried on. And
my name's Yogurt.
Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into any detail at all.
You tell us, lady.
Teaching company course on the Iliad, I spend an entire lecture discussing this. This is what's called the Homeric question, the question of whether there was one author who wrote both epics, or even one author per epic, or whether they're the culmination of a centuries-long oral poetic tradition. For now, I'll just say that in 1928, a brilliant American scholar named Milman Parry demonstrated through analyzing the language, the poetic form, and so forth of the Iliad and the Odyssey, Milman Parry demonstrated that these poems show all the hallmarks of oral composition and oral performance. That what we have in these
I'm gonna
texts,
build
in
this
effect,
reindeer
is the
right here.
recording of an oral poet singing an orally performed poem rather than a literary work from the beginning. Just about every modern scholar accepts Milman Parry's demonstration that the Homeric epics are grounded in traditional oral composition, but scholars still disagree on the implications of that fact for our understanding of exactly how the poems came into being and came into the form in which we have them. Most particularly, we do not know and probably never will know how they came to be written down. Milman Parry, working with modern-day oral bards, working in a purely oral tradition, Serbo-Croatian bards, found that at least in modern days, a bard who works orally, who is himself illiterate and who composes as he sings, is very, very scornful of writing.
Yeah,
He sees a crutch,
there's legs.
he sees it as a diminution of his tradition. So it is highly unlikely that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written down by the same oral bard who performed them. How they came to be written down, who did it, how he did it, sitting there with a roll of papyrus and trying to scribble away as the bard performed, we do not know. All we know is that somehow these orally composed works came to be put in writing because, after all, we have them. So these are very, very vast questions that scholars still debate and disagree about, but there is general consensus that we are dealing with poems that originally were composed orally. The mythic background of the Homeric epics, as I've already mentioned, is the story of the Trojan War, which is the most famous myth or legend, whichever you want to call it, in Greco-Roman literature. The war took place, as most people know, when the Trojan prince Paris kidnapped the Greek woman Helen, who was wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Helen was the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris kidnapped her, took her away to Troy with him. Menelaus' older brother Agamemnon raised a fleet of 1,000 ships and an army to man it, and sailed to Troy to retrieve Helen. The abduction of Helen was seen as an offense against the entire family, not just against Menelaus himself, and so Agamemnon, as the older brother, was responsible for heading the expedition. I would like to find this piece too. There it is. The war over Helen lasted for 10 years, and it ended when the Greeks resorted to trickery with the ruse of the Trojan horse. Now, as I already mentioned, neither the Iliad nor the Odyssey gives us the entire story of the Trojan War. Luckily, we have the entire story in bits and pieces scattered throughout ancient literature, so we can reconstruct it. The Iliad focuses on events that happened during a short period in the last year of the war. The Odyssey deals with Odysseus's further adventures after the war. Now, on the most basic level, the Iliad's subject matter is the anger of the great Greek hero Achilles. The opening words of the Iliad are "Goddess, sing the wrath of Achilles." In fact, in Greek,
why was Achilles so pissed off?
Wrath or anger, manen is the Greek word. Achilles is angry because Agamemnon, the leader of the expedition, has taken away Achilles' concubine Briseis. And because of this insult,
that's all it was about,
Achilles
was a bitch.
Grows so angry that he withdraws from the fighting. He leaves his fellow Greeks to suffer great losses at the hands of the Trojans. Achilles is the Greeks' greatest fighter, their greatest defender. So when he withdraws from battle, the Greeks begin to suffer great losses at the hands of the Trojans. By starting his narrative with this particular episode, the quarrel of Achilles and Agamemnon in the last year of the war, the bard is able to focus in not on narrating the whole story of the war, but rather on articulating some crucial themes of the warrior ethos, of what it meant to be a warrior in this war. And to understand why Achilles becomes so angry that he wants to leave his fellow soldiers to suffer destruction at the hands of the Trojans, we have to look at the Homeric hero's motivations for fighting in the first place. Remember, Helen was Menelaus' wife. Menelaus and Agamemnon both have a good, strong personal reason for fighting. The rest of these Greek warriors don't. Why are they there? What's in it for them? Excuse me. The answer that Homer would give is what is in it for them is two concepts, time and kleos. Time is often translated honor, and that is what it means, but it means honor in a very tangible, physical sense. Honor in the sense of the gifts or spoils spoils or prizes that a warrior is awarded by his fellow warriors as a representation of how well he has fought. So time does mean honor, but it's honor expressed through gifts, through possessions, through spoils. And
This piece should
often
be easy enough to
your
find.
time is expressed through one particular prize of honor. That's the usual English translation of the Greek word geros. A geros is a particular trophy, a particular prize of honor. Briseis, the concubine, is Achilles' geros. And so when Agamemnon takes away Briseis, he is removing the tangible expression of Achilles' honor, and it is an extremely grievous insult. Kleos,
Very grievous.
the second thing for which a Homeric hero fights, can be translated as glory or fame. Its most basic meaning is what other people say aloud about you, what is spoken about you, your reputation, your glory, your fame, in particular, what people say about you after you are dead. And of course, the two concepts are interrelated. The more time you have, the greater your kleos is likely to be after your death. So Agamemnon dishonors Achilles by taking away Achilles' geros, his prize of honor, his concubine.
Ever take a man's geros?
Why would Agamemnon do that? He does it because of a loss of honor he himself has suffered. He has had to return his own concubine, Chryseis, to her father at the orders of the god Apollo. So Agamemnon
I'm going to start a whole war over geros.
Lost time by taking away Achilles' concubine. And you can see there that time seems to be conceived of as a sort of zero-sum game. If I have more of it, you have less of it. There's a certain amount of goods, of spoils, of loot of war to be apportioned out, and if one person gets more, everyone else gets correspondingly less. So Agamemnon tries to restore his own time by dishonoring, teammating, if I may, Achilles. This is why
Roland Garros.
angry, why he withdraws from battle.
Achilles sounds like a little fucking bitch, honestly.
Fight against the Trojans. In fact, he even threatens to return home. And within the context of Achilles' own society, it seems to me that his reaction is not excessive. Modern readers, modern students often say he's acting like a spoiled brat and have very little sympathy for Achilles. But within the framework, the conceptions of his own society, a warrior's sense of worth is very largely determined by how others perceive him and what others say about him. And so Agamemnon has done more than just insult or dishonor Achilles. I'm not trying to exclude the purely personal and sexual insult when one man seduces or takes away another man's concubine. Obviously, there's a personal insult going on there as well.
Yeah.
But Agamemnon has done much more than that. He has called Achilles' whole worth, Achilles' whole reason for being there as a warrior into question. And these key concepts that inform the beginning of the Iliad also resonate throughout the whole epic. Time, kleos, the one warrior's motivation for fighting, those are important throughout the entire epic. At this point, I want to give you, as quickly as I can, an outline of the plot of the Iliad, and then focus on the important scene at the end where Achilles and King Priam of Troy meet, and there's an astonishing reconciliation scene when Achilles returns the dead body of Priam's son Hector. But first, a quick plot outline of the Iliad. From books 2 through 18, the Iliad is 24 books long. That means it took 24 papyrus scrolls to write out the Iliad. From books 2 through 18, Achilles refrains from battle. Throughout these books, we see the results of his withdrawal from battle as the Greeks are ever harder pressed by the Trojans, and under the leadership of the greatest Trojan warrior Hector, the Greeks suffer extensive losses. So from books 2 through 18, Achilles sits in his tent by the seashore and does not help his fellow Greeks. As the battle continues, the Greeks realize that they must do something to change their situation. They need Achilles back. And so Agamemnon selects 3 men to serve as an embassy to Achilles, as it's usually called.
Just give him his girlfriend back.
Agamemnon sends an embassy to Achilles to ask Achilles to accept Agamemnon's apology and lavish gifts. Agamemnon will not only give Briseis back, and by the way, he promises that he never touched her, but he'll also give Achilles numerous other gifts as well. So he's doing his best to recompense Achilles for the loss of time by giving him even more time. The embassy goes to Achilles' tent, but he rejects their pleas very, very forcefully. In fact, Achilles remarks that his mother Thetis, a goddess who has foreknowledge of the future, has informed him, Achilles, that he has two possible alternative fates. He can win Kleos by dying at Troy. He can win glory and honor, but he will die at Troy if he stays and fights. Or he can return home and live a long, peaceful, but
Show it home, Achilles.
life. Achilles says in Book 9 to his friends who have come to ask him to return to battle, he says that he chooses the long, uneventful, inglorious life. He's going to go home, forget about being a warrior, forget about Kleos and all of that. And he counsels the other Greeks to sail home as well. Now, finally, since we're only in Book 9,
That's right, they killed his bro.
Achilles does not leave. Finally, he relents to the extent of saying that he won't sail for home, but he still says he won't return to fighting until the Trojans actually reach the Greek camp and set the Greek ships on fire. So he's not going to help until the war actually comes to the Greek camp itself. The turning point of the Iliad comes in Book 16.
What's it, when Paris gets killed?
Changes his mind about
When Paris gets killed, isn't it?
given him, but rather because Achilles' beloved friend and companion, Patroclus, for those of you who have seen the movie Troy, not his cousin, his beloved friend and companion, Patroclus, goes into battle in Achilles' place. Patroclus asks Achilles for his armor. Patroclus puts on Achilles' recognizable, identifiable armor, goes into battle in the hope that the Trojans will think he is Achilles.
That's
and
right.
The psychological
Paris kills him.
impact of that will be enough to turn the tide of battle. And so Achilles sends Patroclus into battle in his stead, tells him, be careful, don't go all the way to the walls of Troy, watch out for yourself. Patroclus goes into battle in Achilles' armor and is, of course, killed by Hector.
Hector.
And
I was close.
death is the crucial turning point of the Iliad, because after Patroclus' death in Book 16 and the fight over his body between Greeks and Trojans in Book 17, the Greeks do recover his body, both the focus of the narrative and particularly Achilles' own character change. From here on out, from the death of Patroclus on, Achilles is no longer concerned about his teammate or about Kleos. Instead, he is focused entirely on a desire for vengeance against Hector. And from Book 18 all the way through Book 23, the next to the last book of the Iliad, Achilles' return to battle is foregrounded. He's fueled by a desperate desire for vengeance against Hector. He slays countless other Trojans trying to get to Hector, but his one impulse is to find Hector, meet him, and kill him. And of course, eventually in Book 22, Hector and Achilles do meet in single combat. Achilles kills Hector, and his desire for vengeance continues even after Hector's death. As everyone knows, Achilles ties Hector's body to the back of his chariot and drags the body around the walls of Troy under the eyes of Hector's aged parents, Priam and Hecuba, who are watching from the walls. Book 24,
Achilles is a badass.
provides the resolution of the Iliad through a meeting between Achilles and Hector's father, the aged King Priam. Priam comes to Achilles' tent to ask for the body of his son back, to ransom the body of his son. Achilles agrees to return Hector's body, and the Iliad ends with the funeral of Hector. Now, within this basic plot line, Achilles' anger, his withdrawal from battle, his return to battle to get vengeance for Patroclus, one of the most important themes that the poet shows us from various different sides is what can be called the human condition, what it means to be human, what the implications of that are, and most particularly, what it means to be mortal, to have to die, and to have to tolerate the deaths of others. And central, I think, in the Iliad's conception of the human condition is what I like to call the paradox of Kleos, specifically the paradox of Kleos Aptheton, imperishable glory, undying fame. That's what the phrase Kleos Aptheton means in Greek, imperishable glory or undying fame. And this undying fame, this imperishable glory, is the only kind of meaningful immortality available to Homeric warriors. Homer does recognize an afterlife of sorts. There's an underworld, and after death, the soul, spelled exactly like psyche, which is the word we derive from it, but it means soul or spirit. At death, the Psyche leaves the body and goes to the underworld, but the existence of the soul in the underworld
So far, this hasn't turned out
vague,
so great for me.
unsubstantial, undifferentiated. In the Odyssey, we're told that the souls of the dead do not even know themselves or recognize one another unless someone gives them a drink of blood, which returns their wits and their minds to them. So while there is an afterlife in the Homeric worldview, it is certainly not one that's calculated to provide any kind of consolation for bodily death. There's no reward for the virtuous. There's nothing like that. There's not even self-awareness, really, in the afterlife. So only kleos, only what people say about you after you die, provides any kind of significant immortality. The Homeric warrior lives on in and only in what others say about him after his death. And that, by the way, is one element that I think the movie Troy got absolutely right. The stress on, even in the voiceover at the very end, the stress on what people will say about us after we are dead, about being talked about, our names being remembered. That's very Homeric. Now, this view of mortality and its implications that I've been outlining here in the Iliad is in many ways very similar to the one we talked about in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the Iliadic picture of kleos is even more limited than the kind of immortality through fame that Gilgamesh seems to arrive at the end of his epic when he looks upon the walls of the city.
Need this piece here.
Unlike Gilgamesh,
Where
who
is
can look
it?
at the walls of his city Uruk and apparently find some sort of recompense for death in that. For the heroes of the Iliad, kleos can only be gained
Not
on the
it.
battlefield. And if you think about what that means, it means that the one way of gaining kleos, your one real avenue to immortality, is either through killing others or through dying yourself, or most likely through both. And that's why I call kleos in the Iliad paradoxical. The only form of meaningful immortality available to these warriors is inextricably linked not to any lasting human achievement, but specifically to death and killing. Of course, facing one's own death is only half of the problem of the human condition. That's what Gilgamesh focuses on. He grieves for Enkidu, and then he says, I'm going to die too, and goes off looking for immortality. In the Iliad, the stress is more on the acceptance of the death of those dear to us. Achilles has to come to terms with the fact that Patroclus has died. Achilles has to
No way
accept
that goes
the
there.
death of his dearest friend. And the
No
latter part
effing
of
way.
the Iliad
But it looks like it does.
addresses Achilles' difficulty in
It's
accepting
ridiculous.
the human condition, accepting what it means to be
Ridiculous.
human when it applies specifically to Patroclus, to his beloved friend. In books 18 through 23, when Achilles is consumed with a desire for vengeance, he also refuses to accept the reality of Patroclus' death to such an extent that Achilles himself is almost depicted as inhuman in these books. He puts his own life on hold. He will not eat, he won't sleep, he won't bathe, he won't engage in sexual relations. In other words, he will not act like a living adult male human being. It's as though with Patroclus' death, Achilles' own life has gone into abeyance. Fascinatingly, he's described in this section of the Iliad in terms that are normally applied to dead warriors. He lies in the dust grieving for Patroclus, and the verb that's used is a verb that's normally applied to a dead warrior lying in the dust. He utterly rejects Hector's suggestion that whichever one of them kills the other should treat the dead body with respect. Hector, when he's dying, says to Achilles, please send my body back to my parents.
No.
And Achilles rejects this. He says that there is no one who can hold the dogs off from your head, not if they bring here and set before me 10 times and 20 times the ransom. So he refuses to act appropriately towards the dead, and he refuses to act appropriately in his own life.
F him.
And even after he has killed Hector and has dishonored Hector's dead body, Achilles still cannot reconcile himself to Patroclus' death. He is acting inappropriately not only towards the dead Hector, but also, interestingly enough, towards the dead Patroclus, because Achilles will not give Patroclus a funeral. Again, he cannot accept the reality that all of us have to accept, that even those we love most dearly do and will and must die. Achilles says, no, I don't accept that. And
Don't accept it. You don't have to accept it.
He refuses to give Patroclus a funeral until Patroclus' ghost appears and asks for a funeral. Patroclus says, I'm unburied, my ghost is wandering, I can't get into the underworld with the other dead souls. Now, as I just said, the underworld is not a very pleasant place, but apparently it's even worse to be trapped in between life and death, to be a wandering soul who cannot even get into the underworld. Patroclus' ghost says to Achilles, until you bury me, I cannot go into Hades, I cannot go into the underworld, please give me my funeral. Achilles does. When Patroclus himself asks for it, Achilles gives his friend the appropriate funeral, but even that, a funeral is supposed to provide some sort of acceptance for those who are left living. Even after Patroclus' funeral, Achilles continues to fast, continues not to bathe, and continues to drag Hector's dead corpse behind his chariot wheels. Now he drags it around the tomb of Patroclus.
So you don't kill a man.
Walls of Troy. But clearly, Achilles is not moving towards any kind of acceptance at all.
He accepted that he don't give a fuck.
The gods
What do you mean he
themselves
hasn't
decide
accepted?
to intervene. Zeus sends Thetis, Achilles' mother, to speak to him and tell him he has to give Hector's body back to
Don't do
Priam.
shit.
And Zeus sends Iris, the messenger goddess, to tell Priam, go to the camp of the Greeks, visit Achilles' tent, and ransom your son's body. Priam does this. He goes and visits Achilles, and somehow this visit from his enemy allows Achilles to accept the reality of death and loss as nothing else has. As words from his mother, words from his friends, nothing else has gotten through to him. Priam's words do. Priam enters Achilles' tent, kneels before Achilles, kisses his hands, and beseeches him in his father Peleus' name, in Achilles' father's name, to pity Priam and return Hector's body. He says in one of the most beautiful scenes in all of the Iliad, which means in all of Greek literature, Priam speaks to the man who has killed his son. He says, Achilles, like the gods, remember your father, one who is of years like mine and on the doorsill of sorrowful old age. Surely he, when he hears of you and that you are still living, is gladdened within his heart, and all his days he is hopeful that he will see his beloved son come home from the Troad. But for me, my destiny was evil. I have had the noblest of sons in Troy, but I say not one of them is left to me. 50 were my sons when the sons of the Achaeans
Damn,
came
50
here.
kids.
19 were born to me from the womb of a single mother, and of these violent Ares broke the strength in the knees of most of them, but one was left me, who guarded my city and people. That one you killed a few days since, as he fought in defense of his country, Hector, for whose sake I come now. And then he ends up saying, honor then the gods, Achilles, and take pity upon me, remembering your father, yet I am still more pitiful. I have gone through what no other mortal on earth has gone through. I put my lips to the hands of the man who has killed my children. And this, somehow, as I say, gets through to Achilles as nothing else has been able to. He reacts with wonder and compassion, agrees to return Hector's body. The two enemies, Priam and Achilles, sit and weep together. The narrator tells us Priam is weeping for Hector, Achilles is weeping for Patroclus, and Achilles comforts Priam by reminding him that all human beings must bear grief, adversity, and pain. Exactly what others have been saying to Achilles, he couldn't hear on his own behalf. He sees this old man kneeling, kissing his hands, and weeping, and then he is able to say, this is what humans must endure. So it's through recognizing the humanity of his enemy that Achilles finally accepts mortality and is thus himself reintegrated into humanity. Now, part of Homer's genius is that he doesn't explain how this happens. He simply shows us that it does. I always feel both extremely presumptuous and extremely inadequate when I try to talk about this scene in the Iliad. It is one of the most powerful scenes anywhere in literature. Homer has the sense not to explain it, but just present it. I have to try to explain it. I apologize. As this scene moves on, Achilles himself serves a meal to Priam. They eat together. Achilles promises a truce of 11 days so the Trojans can give Hector a proper funeral. Achilles has a bed prepared for Priam, and he himself goes to bed and sleeps beside Briseis. That's the last time we see Achilles in the Iliad. He's fully reintegrated into humanity. The final paradox, of course, is that we, the audience, know, because we know the story, that Achilles himself will now die. He will return to battle and he will himself be killed. So the paradox of Kleos returns. Achilles' reintegration into humanity means reintegration into mortality. He will himself be killed. So, in this lecture, we've looked at the Iliad all too briefly. In the next lecture, we will turn to and give an equally brief discussion of the other Homeric epic, the Odyssey.
It's gotta be those legs. It's gotta be those legs.
Welcome back to Lecture 8, in which we're going to continue our discussion of Homeric epic by looking at the Odyssey. And I want to look at the Odyssey in terms of its treatment of the human condition and particularly of the necessary acceptance of mortality, just as I did with the Iliad. These themes, the acceptance of mortality, what it means to be human, are no less important in the Odyssey than they were in the Iliad, but the focus is different. Both epics, both the Iliad and the Odyssey, present human mortality as something that must be faced and accepted without any compensation.
We need his muzzle. We need his muzzle.
Again, the afterlife,
This must be the
in
ear.
the Homeric
The
worldview, offers us no
Is it that
recompense, no
ear?
compensation for mortality. So mortality has to be faced and dealt with within the confines of human life itself. And this is foregrounded in the Odyssey no less than in the Iliad. In fact, in both of these epics, the main character, Achilles in the Iliad, Odysseus in the Odyssey, is somehow set aside from humanity, isolated and alone. Achilles' isolation, of course, is self-chosen. He withdraws from his tent, he refuses to fight, and so forth. Odysseus' isolation is imposed upon him during his 10 years of wandering after the war. He spent 7 of those years as a captive on the island of the nymph Calypso. But in both epics, despite the different settings, the main character is
Could swear I saw that nose somewhere over there.
alone, without help
Unless
from
this is
others.
the nose.
In both epics, the resolution depends on the main character's
it might
willing
be.
acceptance of mortality and his reintegration into humanity through that
So the
acceptance. I talked
nose.
in the last lecture about how Achilles' encounter with Priam leads to his acceptance of mortality and to his reintegration into his own society. In this epic, we'll see how it works with Odysseus. But there are some major differences, because the Iliad focuses on the losses inflicted directly by death, particularly by the death of others, the death of comrades. But the Odyssey, it seems to me, meditates instead on accepting the losses inflicted on us by life. Loss of youth, loss of time, acceptance of our unfilled aspirations that they will remain unfilled, those sorts of things. Now, there's certainly a lot of death in the Odyssey as well. Odysseus loses all his companions on the way home from Troy. All his men are lost in one disaster after another. But the main point that I want to focus on here
So that must
is
mean this one goes over there.
Not just of his own mortality, but of everything that implies for the rest of his life, for while he is still alive. Achilles' main task, as we talked about in the previous lecture, was to accept the loss of Patroclus, the death of another whom he dearly loves. Odysseus' main task is to accept his own mortality, and he does this in the face of an offer of immortality from the nymph Calypso. She offers to let him stay on her island with him forever, and she says she will make him immortal and ageless. He chooses not to accept that. Odysseus is an important character in the Iliad. He's renowned for his cleverness, his skill in rhetoric. The Odyssey recounts his adventures after the Trojan War. Now, we know from various other sources and from references in the Odyssey itself that many of the Greeks had great difficulty in returning home from Troy. Agamemnon made it home, but upon his arrival back home, he was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. Menelaus and Helen were driven off course and were marooned or isolated for 7 years in Egypt before they finally made it back to Sparta. Many of the other Greeks died on the way home, were lost at sea. But Odysseus's difficulties in making the journey home from Troy were without question the greatest of all. It took him 10 full years to make the journey back. Thus, by the time he arrived back on his home island of Ithaca, he had been absent for nearly 20 years. The Odyssey describes both his wanderings during his 10 years of absence and the dangers he faces in reclaiming his family, his home, and his kingdom upon his return to Ithaca.
Whoa,
Now,
don't fall,
the
buddy.
narrative structure of the Odyssey is very complicated. This is not a straightforward chronological telling, beginning with the day Odysseus leaves Troy and ending up with the day he's reunited with his wife Penelope. Instead, the bard, the poet, plays around with the structure in some very surprising ways. The first 4 books of the 24 books of the Odyssey, the first 4 books are concerned primarily not with Odysseus at all, but with his son Telemachus.
Doesn't.
Books 1 and 2 show us
Looks like it
Telemachus
does.
at home on Ithaca, on Odysseus' home island. And Telemachus is a young man of about 20. He was an infant when Odysseus went to Troy, so he's now a young man, a grown man. Books 3 and 4 show Telemachus traveling to visit 2 of Odysseus' comrades from the Trojan War, Nestor, the oldest and wisest of the Greeks, and Menelaus, back home now in Sparta with Helen. Telemachus goes to visit these 2 old comrades of his father. In book 3 and 4, he's seeking news of his father. He wants to try to find out what has happened to Odysseus. So the first 4 books of the Odyssey focus on Telemachus, Odysseus' son. In fact, they're often referred to as the Telemachy. If the Odyssey is the story of Odysseus, the Telemachy would be the story of Telemachus. And that's a term that scholars often use to refer
Where
to
them
the
legs?
books of the Odyssey. Books 5 through 8
So that's got to be those legs, right?
Odysseus' own
I
story.
think so.
At the beginning of book 5, we see Odysseus on Calypso's island. He's being held captive by this nymph. A nymph is a minor goddess who wants to make him her husband. She wants to keep him there with her forever and make him immortal and ageless so that he can be her husband and live with her forever.
No, it's not going to fit there.
At the beginning of book 5,
I don't think that even goes there, does it? Yeah, it does.
lets Odysseus go. Athena, who is
Athena.
Odysseus' patron goddess, points out to Zeus that it's time for Odysseus to go home. Zeus sends a message to Calypso. The god Hermes sends a messenger, and Calypso agrees that she will let Odysseus go. From Calypso's island, Odysseus journeys to another island called Scheria, which is inhabited by a people called the Phaeacians. And these people are famous for providing ships for stranded travelers. They will, and they do, give him a ship to take him back home to Ithaca. So books 5 through 8 get Odysseus from Calypso's island, where he's been captive for 7 years, back to Scheria, from where he will be sent home to Ithaca. Now, books 9 through 12 are a flashback to Odysseus' earlier adventures, the adventures he had between the time he left Troy and the time when he arrived on Calypso's island. So books 9 through 12 give us all the swashbuckling, fantastic fairy tale-like adventures of the Odyssey. These are the books that feature the most famous adventures. This is the part of the text that people normally think of when they think of the Odyssey. It's in books 9 through 12 that Odysseus meets and blinds the Cyclops Polyphemus, son of the god Poseidon, which, by the way, motivates all his later troubles. Poseidon, the sea god, hates Odysseus and so won't let his journey home prosper. It's in books 9 through 12 that Odysseus has to sail between Scylla and Charybdis, meets the Sirens, goes on a journey to the underworld to talk to the dead, and so forth. And these books 9 through 12, are narrated in the first person. Odysseus tells his adventures to the people of Scheria, the Phaeacians. He tells them his adventures in the hope of winning their goodwill so that they'll give him a ship to send him home. Then the story shifts to third-person narration again and to purely chronological order again in Book 13, where Odysseus finally arrives back home on his home island, Ithaca. Then the second half of the Odyssey, Books 13 through 24, are concerned with Odysseus reintegrating himself into his society, getting into his palace, being reunited with his wife and son, and so forth. So a purely chronological arrangement of the Odyssey would put books 9 through 12 first,
Finally making some progress here.
Followed by books 13 through 24. Books 1 through 4, Telemachus' adventures, happen in the same time frame as books 5
Where's
through 8.
this hump
So as I
piece?
say, it's a very, very complicated structure. There are probably many reasons we could think of for why a bard would choose to arrange his work this way, but one obvious point is that by delaying Odysseus's entrance for 4 full books, the bard lets us see just how badly Odysseus is needed back on Ithaca. The bard lets us see how Odysseus's family and his society, his family and his community, have both suffered through his absence. For Odysseus's family, primarily here I'm thinking of his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, but he also has an aged father, Laertes, still alive on Ithaca. For Odysseus's family, the fact that they cannot know if he is alive or dead is not only emotionally wearing, it also causes severe practical problems. They do not know how to order, how to arrange their own lives. Odysseus's wife Penelope is being courted by over 100 young suitors, young men from Ithaca and the surrounding islands who want to marry her. Now, if she is a widow, if Odysseus is dead, Penelope has a clear duty to remarry while she's still just young enough to have children with her new husband, to leave her household as it is to Telemachus, let him inherit his father's house. It is her duty, if Odysseus is dead, to remarry and form a new family. But if Odysseus is alive, it is no less clearly her absolute duty to remain faithful to him and wait until he comes home and protect the household for him until his return. And Penelope has no way of knowing if Odysseus is alive or dead. So she has no way of knowing which of those two duties she should act upon. Odysseus' son Telemachus is in a somewhat similar position. He doesn't know if he is guarding the kingdom for his absent father, if he is in effect acting as a steward, taking care of the kingdom until his father comes back, or if he is himself king, who should assert himself as such and assert his rights over the rulership of Ithaca. And Odysseus's absence causes great problems for his whole community, in part because the Odyssey, and for that matter the Iliad as well, take it absolutely for granted that monarchy is the only form of government around. A society must have a king. Odysseus is king of Ithaca, so this is a society that has, in effect, been without its government, been without its king for 20 years, and has suffered great disarray as a consequence. Right. The focal point for the disarray at Ithaca, the way Homer shows us just how disordered things are in Ithaca, is the suitors, that group of young men who are trying to marry Penelope. As suitors, they're destroying Odysseus' household and threatening his marriage. Let me explain what I mean by destroying his household. They've basically moved in. They're there all the time. Telemachus asks them to go away, they won't. They're eating Telemachus' food, drinking his wine, harassing his mother, seducing the women servants. They're basically just causing complete disorder and disruption in Odysseus' household, as well as trying to marry Odysseus' wife. And implicit in their suit is the idea that whichever Odysseus does, in fact, marry Penelope, will become ruler of Ithaca. So they're not only threatening Odysseus' rights to his wife and to his kingship, they're also threatening Telemachus' rights to his inheritance. Their complete disregard of the proprieties. Again, Telemachus asks them to go away, asks them to go to one of their own houses, eat their own food, drink their own wine for a change. They completely ignore this request. They threaten to kill Telemachus. Their wanton disregard of the
I need to get this antler done. Do it now.
Of a society that's been without its rightful ruler for 20 years. And just to make the tension all the greater, Homer starts the Odyssey at the precise point where things are coming to a crisis, where the situation is building to an end.
Need to be done.
Because now that Odysseus has been gone for 20 years, Telemachus is grown. While Telemachus was a child, Penelope could more or less put on hold her decision of whether to remarry or not. She could focus on bringing up her son, taking care of him, maintaining that household, whether she was maintaining it for her absent husband or for her minor son. Either way, her duty was to maintain that household. But now Telemachus is grown. If Penelope is a widow, she should step out of the way and let him claim his kingdom. But she doesn't know if she's a widow or not. Similarly, from Telemachus' point of view, he is no longer a child. He needs to assert his rights, his authority, but he doesn't know exactly what kind of authority he has to assert. Is he crown prince or is he king? And so 20 years is just the point at which things are gathering to a head when Odysseus is needed home badly and needed home now. So the first 4 books show us that. They hammer home to us just how desperately needed Odysseus is on his own island. Our first view of Odysseus himself comes in book 5, when Calypso, the nymph who's keeping him captive, approaches him and says to him that he may leave her island. She tells him that she's changed her mind, she'll let him go, Zeus has ordered her to do so. The interaction here in book 5 between Odysseus and Calypso foregrounds what I've been calling the human condition, and particularly Odysseus's understanding of its implications. As I've already mentioned, Calypso has offered Odysseus, during his captivity of 7 years with her, she has offered him the chance to become immortal, become a god, stay with her forever, be young and carefree and happy on a desert island with a beautiful goddess as his wife forever. Sounds horrible, right? Odysseus turns her down. He chooses to remain human and to return home. Now, Greek mythology is filled with stories of humans who try for immortality, who try to gain immortality. The dividing line, the primary dividing line between gods and humans in Greek myth and the Greek myth worldview is that gods cannot die and humans must die. And there are many, many stories of humans who try to gain immortality. These stories almost always end disastrously, but the point is that Greek myth recognizes that most of us at least think, as Gilgamesh did, that we would like to live forever. So by rejecting Calypso's offer, Odysseus is rejecting what many characters in Greek myth think they desperately want, and he's doing so because he not only accepts, but desires the human condition. His desire to return home is a desire, in effect, to return to his full humanity, to return to his selfhood. Odysseus, isolated from Penelope, Telemachus, his father Laertes, his home, his people, is in a very real sense not Odysseus at all. And faced with this choice, remain young and immortal forever, but do not
see
be
this piece anywhere.
or be who you are, which includes knowing that you must die and that all you love must die. He chooses to be Odysseus. He chooses to be human. He's offered what Gilgamesh went on a journey to seek, and he refuses
another piece
it
of
because
yellow.
he realizes that it is not the right state for him or for any human to be in, and Odysseus wants to be Odysseus. Odysseus wants to be human. Our knowledge of the situation on Ithaca reiterates Odysseus' own sense of urgency in his desire to return home. He not only wants to go home, he wants to go home as quickly as possible, and not just for understandable reasons of homesickness after 20 years. He knows how badly he's needed on Ithaca.
Right.
Because, as Odysseus himself tells us in Book 11, he visited the underworld as part of his travels. He went to the underworld to speak to the soul of the prophet Tiresias, one of the greatest prophets who had ever lived. And Tiresias told Odysseus that suitors would court his wife Penelope. So
Hell
in the
yeah.
7 years that Odysseus has been sitting captive on Calypso's island, which happened, of course, after his trip to the underworld, during those 7 years, he has not only missed his family, he has known that his family is under direct threat from other men who are trying to marry Penelope and probably to get rid of Telemachus. So his longing for home is increased by his fear of what's happening.
Oh, wait, that's his ear right there. You
now,
idiot.
as I already said, books 9 through 12, in which Odysseus narrates his own wanderings, are the more famous part of the Odyssey. But for what I'm trying to do in this lecture, the more important section
Might be
is
the tail,
second
actually.
half of the Odyssey, books 13 through 24, which show us what happens once Odysseus is back on Ithaca.
Of course, this is not
The
centered,
second half
right?
of the
So
Odyssey differs noticeably from the first half in its pace. It slows down markedly. Basically, all that happens in the last 12 books of the Odyssey is that Odysseus returns home to Ithaca. The goddess Athena disguises him as a beggar. He gets into the palace without anyone knowing who he is. With Athena's help, he kills all the suitors, and he and Penelope are reunited. Now, if this were included as part of Odysseus' own narrative of his wanderings in book 9 through 12, he'd probably spend about 15 lines of poetry on it. Homer spends the entire second half of the Odyssey on just that, if we strip it down to its narrative basis. So the pace of the second half of the Odyssey slows down markedly. And also, the kind of challenges Odysseus faces are very, very different in the second half of the Odyssey from the first half of the Odyssey.
No.
Odysseus is still in grave
Is it?
danger.
No.
These suitors who have been plotting to kill Telemachus would certainly not hesitate to kill Odysseus if they knew who he
No.
was. And there are over 100 of them. There's only one of him.
There
So
it
if he
is.
just walks into his palace, opens the
Hell
door,
yeah.
and says, Penelope, I'm home,
All right, that
he's
deer
going
is
to be
pretty
killed
much
by the
done.
suitors. He is still in grave danger of
Just
his
need
life,
his nose.
just as he was when he fought the Cyclops.
The hell's that nose?
Sailed through Scylla
I
and
swear I had
Charybdis,
that nose
just
set
as he's been
aside
over
somewhere.
and over again in his wanderings. But the dangers he faces are no
Oh,
longer
shit.
dangers from supernatural forces, hungry monsters, lustful goddesses. Rather,
I'm gonna
they
have to
are
transfer this to a
mundane,
different.
everyday dangers.
Something
of
else.
his wife trying to kill him. And the way he
That
has to
does not fit
avoid
on this
this
board.
danger is first and foremost not through physical prowess, not through fighting, though he does fight the suitors when it comes down to it, but rather the main thing he has to do in the second half of the
I wonder if
Odyssey
closing
is
this will help that.
exercise
Hell yeah, that makes it look
self-control.
a lot better.
Athena disguises him as a beggar. I'll come back to that point in just a minute. And in disguise,
Much better closing the window.
Is first reunited with his son Telemachus and then with his wife Penelope. He first meets the suitors in disguise. He has to exercise
Not so great for my eyes, though.
self-control, not to show by any facial expression, by any tone of voice, by anything at all, that
Yeah,
he
that's
is
too much.
who he is. So when he's insulted by the suitors, when he sees his family for the first time in 20 years, he can't let any emotion show because he has to keep his identity secret. So he's still undergoing extreme danger, and he's still having to exercise extreme
Is that the nose?
virtue,
Looks like the nose, don't it?
to overcome
Hell yeah.
that danger, but the type is different in the second half.
All right,
of the
we move
Odyssey
on
from
to
the
this
first
little
half of the
guy.
Odyssey. Now, as I just said, when Odysseus first arrives back on Ithaca,
Now we need
Athena
the tail.
disguises
We got
him
the tail
as an
there.
old beggar, and she advises him to go stay with one of his very few loyal servants. One of the few slaves who has remained loyal to Odysseus is an old
Odysseus.
swineherd named Eumaeus. Athena advises Odysseus to go stay with this loyal swineherd.
Swineherd.
Athena is Odysseus' patron. He's her
Any
particular
relation to
favorite.
Schweinhunds?
He doesn't know it. We as the audience know it. She's already helped him on his way home. As I already mentioned, it was she who advised Zeus to send a message to Calypso
How's
saying
this
it's
go?
time to let Odysseus go. From Odysseus' point of view, he hasn't seen Athena for 10 long years. She helped him at Troy. He doesn't know that she's been behind the scenes since. But now on Ithaca, her help is crucial because she can disguise Odysseus. She makes him look
It
older
is
and uglier
bullshit.
than he is, and she disguises him as a beggar. And being a beggar is the one crucial element of this disguise. If you think about it, as a beggar, Odysseus can enter his own palace unannounced, unnoticed by the suitors. Nobody will look at him and think, now who is that and what is he doing here? A beggar is doing what a beggar would always be doing at the rich people's feast. He's begging for scraps of food. It makes perfect sense. He can come into the palace without anyone wondering who he is or why he's there. And furthermore, I think this is a very important point. Nobody will look very carefully at it. How carefully do we look at beggars? When a panhandler comes up to one of us on the street and asks for change, do we really look at that person carefully? Do we really notice them at all? I think not, actually.
I think not.
So a beggar can get into the palace, can scope out the situation, talk to the suitors, talk to Penelope even, perhaps, as in fact he does, and nobody will in any way question what he's doing there. So, Athena disguises Odysseus as a beggar. Odysseus goes to the hut of the Eumaeus, and there in Book 16, he's reunited with his son Telemachus. I want to focus now on two reunion scenes. Odysseus' reunion with
I want to
Telemachus
focus
in
on
Book
one.
16, and his reunion with his wife
Reunion of
Penelope
me
in
and my
Book
brain.
23. Both of these reunions are very, very important for my theme of the way the Odyssey foregrounds the inevitable losses that life inflicts upon us, as well as the loss of death itself. Odysseus' reunion with Telemachus takes place when Athena brings Telemachus back from his visit to Sparta and tells him to go see the old swineherd Eumaeus in Eumaeus' hut. So Telemachus comes in. Odysseus is there in disguise as a beggar. Eumaeus, of course, recognizes Telemachus immediately. Eumaeus knows Telemachus perfectly well. Odysseus, in character as a beggar, must sit there, watch Eumaeus jump up, say to Telemachus, Telemachus, you have come back. This is the first time Odysseus has ever seen his son in 20 years, the first time he's seen him since infancy, and Odysseus has to suppress all emotion during this first sight of his son, which he successfully does. Finally, in Book 16, sends Eumaeus to the palace. He asks Eumaeus to go tell Penelope that Telemachus is back home safely. Athena beckons Odysseus to the courtyard. Telemachus can't see her, but Odysseus can. Athena tells Odysseus, reveal your true identity to your son. Tell Telemachus who you are. And she taps him with her wand, makes him younger and handsomer again. So when he comes back into the hut, he knows
Should
like
flip
the
this
old
over,
beggar.
but then I'm gonna ruin
Telemachus
the
sees an
actual
old man
painting.
walk out into the courtyard, a much younger man come back in. And Telemachus, understandably, doesn't believe Odysseus when
I don't want to
Odysseus
believe any of
says,
that
I am the
bullshit,
father.
does he?
Telemachus thinks this must be a god. Humans don't normally change appearance like that, so Telemachus thinks this must be a god. Now, Odysseus cannot prove to his son who he is. He can only say to Telemachus, I am your father. He says, interestingly enough, no other Odysseus than I will ever come back to you. Telemachus simply has to take him on faith. And once Odysseus has explained that it was Athena who disguised and undisguised him, Telemachus accepts Odysseus' identity, and the two weep in one another's arms. And Homer, the bard, uses here a remarkable simile to describe their weeping. Homeric epic, the Iliad and the Odyssey, both is very rich in similes. Here, the bard says that Odysseus and Telemachus embrace and weep. And the bard says that they weep and they cry. They cried shrill in a pulsing voice, even more than the outcry of birds whose children were stolen away by the men of the fields before their wings grew strong.
Whoa.
Such was the pitiful cry and the tears their eyes wept. When I teach the Odyssey, I always ask my students, why are they crying? Aren't they happy to see each other? And someone always, or two or three someones often, come up with what I think is exactly the right answer. They're weeping for all that they've lost. They're weeping for those lost 20 years. And that's where the point of the simile comes in. Just as the birds have lost their fledglings from their nest, Odysseus has lost his child. He left an infant, he came back to a young man. In a very real sense, Odysseus never has a child. That's gone, and that can't be given back. And I like to put this scene in direct contrast with Athena's reaction when Odysseus first arrived back on Ithaca. Odysseus asked Athena, basically, where have you been for 10 years? Why did you let me take 10 years to get home?
She's a piece
Why
of shit.
didn't you help me? Why didn't you get me off Calypso's island 7 years ago? And Athena offers him no explanation except she says, I knew my uncle Poseidon, my father's brother Poseidon, was angry at you because you blinded his son the Cyclops, and I didn't want to quarrel with my father's brother, and I knew you'd make it home eventually. I never had any doubt that you'd make it home eventually.
Fucking bitch.
Athena, an immortal goddess, outside the bounds of time and the bounds of aging, doesn't seem to get it, to use the modern phrase.
She gets it. She doesn't give a shit. She sold them out, baby girl. All right.
From her point of view, she says, I knew you'd get home eventually, so what did it matter? From Odysseus' point of view, Penelope's, Telemachus' point of view, 10 years.
10.
It didn't matter. It would have made all the difference in the world. And so when you compare Athena's treatment of Odysseus' absence with the tears that Odysseus and Telemachus weep, that, I think, brings into sharp focus what the difference between immortal gods and mortal humans is.
Mortals.
Well, with the help of Athena, Telemachus, Eumaeus, and one other loyal slave, Odysseus kills all of Penelope's suitors, and then he is finally reunited with his wife Penelope near the end of the Odyssey after 20 years of absence. When Penelope first approaches Odysseus after he has slaughtered the suitors, she doesn't immediately recognize him. She sets him a test. She says that she's going to have their marriage bed moved out into another room so that he can sleep in the bed that he himself built, but not in their bed chamber. This is a test because this bed is rooted into the ground. Odysseus himself built it with one of the posts a living tree.
All right, we gotta move to a new surface. The other one was not serving my purposes. This one gives more room. He and a haw.
The bard once again used a wonderful simile to underline their reunion. He said that Odysseus wept as he held his lovely wife, whose thoughts were virtuous, and as when the land appears welcome to men who are swimming after the sight of his rescue ship on the open water, so welcome.
Very bad move I just did there, but whatever.
Odysseus was as welcome to Penelope as land is welcome to a shipwrecked sailor. This brings the two halves of the Odyssey. Odysseus' wanderings, Penelope's waiting, together in a simile that describes her joy at seeing him to his joy at reaching dry land after wandering. And they weep as they hold each other. So both of these reunion scenes are marked by sorrow as well as by joy. Both of them reflect the reality of human life in all its complexity, in stark contrast to what Odysseus would have had if he had accepted Calypso's offer of immortality. In its story of a man choosing to return to his humanness rather than becoming an ageless immortal, the Odyssey affirms the importance and the worthiness of being human. To be human means to be entwined in sorrow, aging, disease, death, all of those forms of loss, but it's only through those that we can be human, and only in contrast to those that we can know the joy that we do find in being human. And that, I think, is what the Odyssey foregrounds more beautifully than any other text I know. So in this lecture, we've finished our examination of Homeric epic by looking at the Odyssey. In the next lecture, we'll turn to a completely different form of Greek poetry, lyric poetry, or poetry written from the personal viewpoint of the poet.
All right, maybe that's a good point to stop.